Hi, Beetle Eddie here. I found an idea from somebody. Maybe you want to say I'm stealing ideas, but everybody can borrow an idea and give them their own opinion. So a person made a video of the 20 albums in their life that they heard that changed their life. So I said, you know what? That sounds like it could be a good video. So I was thinking, what albums changed my life? And I came up with a list. I didn't do 20, I was going to do 10, but I did a couple more than 10. I actually did 13 albums that changed my life. And the Beatles had 13 albums. Billy Joel said he had 13 albums because the Beatles had 13 albums. That's how much he likes the Beatles. So anyway, the Beatles had 13 albums. So I'm picking 13 albums. Maybe some of them are Beatle albums and maybe some of them are post-Beatle albums. But I'm picking 13 albums that changed my life. So here goes. What comes to my mind, the first album. Album number 1. I know this is not an order of like what's the best to worst, in my opinion. It's just an order of what I feel are great albums that I listened to as a teenager and as in my early 20s of albums that changed my life. Without these albums, I wouldn't be what I wouldn't be into rock and roll the way I am today. The first album, 1968. The White Album by the Beatles. Why did this album change my life? This album came out a day before my 13th birthday. 13, this is the beginning of teenage years. And it's a big time. You're a teenager. You're a teenager from 13 to 19, the adolescent. And most people get into music when they're about 12. Before 12, they're not so much into it. Maybe there's one or two, there's a couple of people that might be into music when they're 10 or even 8. But when they really start getting into liking music and getting into the music, it's about 12. 12 is the age when music starts entering into the head and making people like what they like. For me, it was rock and roll, hard rock, soft rock, hard rock, heavy metal, those kinds of music. The Beatles, the Beatles changed the music, and then then you had European invasion to America, to all the bands, and there was also some American bands that were good too, like Jefferson Airplane and The Doors. So my number 1 album, and that was a day before my 13th birthday, is the White Album. I happened to buy it on release date. I think it was November 22nd, 1968. There's a local store near my house called Tops Record Store. And I walked 2 blocks to the record store and I bought a copy of the White Album. Now, the release dates, in those years, they had numbers on the albums. A and a number. If you get a low number, the lower the number, the rarer it is. I don't have it anymore. But I'm sure I had a low number because I got a release date. So, I must have had a good number. Anyway, I got the album, brought it home. The first album that was put out on Apple Records. And I played it. I must have played it that day, on that Friday, about 4 times, from start to finish. Loved the album. Loved it. Even Revolution number 9. I played, I was, this is kind of a little weird, but it's interesting. So anyway, so why did it change my life? Like I said, when you're 12, 13 years old, you start getting into music, and that's kind of the first album that I purchased when I was actually 12, because it was the day before my birthday. 12 going into 13. So yeah, it's an exciting time. So that's a number one album. And it happens to be that the White Album, it happens to be my favorite album. I don't know if it's that reason, but I just love it. Not because it's a double album, but because it's a great album. Okay, that's my number one thought of albums that changed my life. An album that changed my life, number two, that came to my mind, was an album by Cream. Eric Clapton's album, a band, Cream. Not Queen, but Cream, like cream soda. And it was also came out in 1968. It's interesting. It came out a few months before the White Album. So I was 12. And that album was called Wheels of Fire. Also a double album. And I played that and played that, overplayed it every single day, and probably until the White Album came. The White Album took over Wheels of Fire. Great album, double album. I think one side was live. You had Crossroads on it, done by Clapton. You had Spoonful. You had Toad with like a 15-minute drum solo. One of the greatest drummers in the world. Ginger Baker. And that was a great album. It kind of changed my life. It kind of, changed my way of listening to music and thinking what kind of music I liked. I mean, a year or two earlier, they came out with the big hit of Sunshine of Your Love, which I loved. I loved that song. I recorded it one day. I went to this little recording studio, and I recorded my voice singing it. Don't have that record anymore either. But, so that's another album that changed my life. Wheels of Fire by Cream. Another album. Now, after the Beatles broke up, there was a band that I consider my number two band. Beatles are number one, but in my opinion, number two is Led Zeppelin. It came out in '69, sort of by the time that the Beatles kind of broke up. And they were around 10 years. And, so it was the first album that I really enjoyed. Led Zeppelin 1? No. The first album that I got and played and overplayed was Led Zeppelin 2. With a Whole Lot of Love and Heartbreaker and Ramble On. Great album. Great album. Okay. Another group. Another album. Good, my teenage years. In the early 20s. Listening, hanging out with my friends. They had this album, so I listened to it all the time in their cars and all that. We were playing it while we were going somewhere. Fleetwood Mac, Rumors. Every single one of those songs is great. It's a great album. That sort of changed my life also. All these albums are changing my life. It's monumental in music. Next album, number 5. The Doors, album by The Doors. Is it their debut album? No. The first album I ever heard from The Doors and loved was their second album. The one that has When the Music's Over. I love that album. That's probably my favorite Doors album. Probably because it's my first Doors album. But I love all the Doors albums. And so it was the Doors' Strange Days. That Strange Days, People Were Strange, When the Music's Over, Love Me Two Time. Great album. Next, I couldn't make a list of my 13 best albums without having this group on it. The Rolling Stones. So what album did I pick by them? Just because it kind of changed my life. Albums that changed my life. Being with my friends. Hanging out. Going in their cars. Going places. Hearing this album a lot. When was it made? Like 1978. The album Miss You. Great album. Has Miss You. Shattered. When the Whip Breaks. Yeah, it's a great album. Okay, so that's the next album I have. Another album. It's cool. It sort of changed my life. That's the first time I heard this. I was in my friend's house. We were just listening to albums. I never saw this album before in my life. He said, this is a great album. I said, let's put it on. He said, lay down in bed and just close your eyes, and I'm going to put on this album, which I did. So it's a psychedelic album, he said. So I laid down, I listened to it. Guess what the album was? Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. Loved that album. Sort of changed my life. Got me into liking Pink Floyd. And I think Pink Floyd, The Dark Side of the Moon is probably their best album. Okay, so then you had that one. Next, this is number 8. I said it's not in any order or anything, but this is number 8. I loved the group in the 70s called Foreigner. Played a lot, all of the albums I liked. I like the original Foreigner, the one with Lou Gramm and Mike, what was his name? Mick Jones. Mick Jones and Lou Gramm. The original, and by the way, they were nominated for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame finally, with the original ones, not the ones that are there today. The ones that are there today, there's not one original left. It's Kelly Hansen. He's there like for the last 20 years. But you know what? He's not Lou Gramm. So what album was it? The debut album. The one with Cold as Ice and Feels Like the First Time and Long, Long Way From Home. Great album. Great album. So that's my number 8. Number 9. I'm going to go down to a couple of post-Beatle albums that I loved. The first one, Ram, McCartney. I brought this album to school. It was 1971. I brought it to school, and I said, this is a great album. I think they had a player, a record player then, in the school. And I played it, and everyone loved it. And, it was, to me, it's the best Paul McCartney ever did. So, better than some Beatle things. So, that changed my life because, it's my teenage years. And I brought it to school. I played it for people. I changed their life because they started liking it. Next album, about the same time, maybe even before, Plastic Ono Band, Lennon. Great album. I don't have to say much about it. Mother, Hold On John, I Found Out, Working Class Hero, Isolation, Remember, God. It's a great album. Oh My Love. No, yeah, I think it's on there. Okay. This is a great album. It's John. I think it's John Lennon's best. That's what I think. Okay. Now, next album, also a great album. These are all post-Beatles. All Things Must Pass. Double album of George Harrison. So George Harrison had so many songs that he didn't record as a Beatle because he couldn't. Because most of the songs were by Lennon and McCartney, and then he had 2, maybe 3 the most in an album. Maybe even 1 in one album. He never had many songs. Basically like two in an album. So he accumulated a lot of songs that was never recorded. So he took the advantage of making this album, All Things Must Pass, made in 1970, I believe. And great album. Great album. Another album that changed my life. Ringo. Ringo's first album where it was rock and roll. He did a couple of albums before. He did Sentimental Journey, which is like old songs. Then he did a Bucua Blues, which was like country music. But this is his first rock album. And I believe it's the best of Ringo. And by the way, all the Beatles are on it. Contributing, singing, writing songs. John Lennon wrote I'm the Greatest for Ringo. Paul McCartney did 6 O'Clock. Photograph was a song that was written by Ringo and George. So all 4 Beatles was on this album. It was the closest the Beatles ever came to being together in a recording. Except for those 3 anthology songs. Free as a Bird, Real Love, and of course the recent one, Now and Then. So, so that album is great. So I want to leave it with number 13, album that changed my life, a group called Queen. And this album, not that it's their best album, but I feel it was one of their best. That's because it was played as a teenager with my friends in their cars, going places, doing things. News of the World. Starts out with We Will Rock You and We Are the Champions. Sheer Heart Attack. Get Down, Make Love. Spread Your Wings. All great songs. It's Late. It's a great album. So that's my 13 albums. This is my 13 albums that changed my life. I'm going to go to the list and tell you again. Not that this is in any order of their greatness, but it's just order of what comes to my mind first of albums that changed my life. Number 1, the White Album. Number 2, Wheels of Fire. Number 3, Led Zeppelin 2. Followed by Fleetwood Mac, Rumors. The Doors, Strange Days. The Stones, Miss You. Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. Foreigner, the first Foreigner album, the debut album. Paul McCartney, Ram. John Lennon, Plastic Ono Band. George Harrison, All Things Must Pass. Ringo Starr, Ringo. And Queen, News of the World. That's my list. That's albums that changed my life. I'm sure you have your own. Let's hear. Let me hear some of your albums that changed your life. I'm interested. Let me hear some comments. And please give me a thumbs up. It's good for the channel. And if you like my channel, please subscribe. You could subscribe to get all notifications. You could subscribe for some, or you could subscribe for none.